the title these days. And this is, as Chuck mentioned this morning, part history, part travelogue. Let's see, there we go. So Diocletian, here we have the head, at least, of Diocletian. He was emperor from 284 to 305. He temporarily stopped the decline of the empire, which from the Roman point of view was very important, obviously. From our point of view as Christians, he was the worst persecutor of Christians in the history of the Roman Empire. I mean, he really had it in for us. He was also the only Roman emperor to ever retire. No other Roman emperor, all other Roman emperors died in office, basically. And he is the originator of the cabbages and kings sort of statement, because when he was asked after 3 years into his retirement if he would come back, because they were having all sorts of problems, which I'll get into later in terms of who was running the show. But he said, if you could only see at Salona, close to where he was retiring, the cabbages raised by our hands, you would surely never judge that a temptation. That is coming back to be emperor. So,
Ken, is that where Lewis Carroll got his phrase, cabbages and kinks?
I am not really sure. I almost put the entire Lewis Carroll quote in there as well, but yeah, it may have been. But this is certainly a famous statement of his. And in the spring of 2019, actually, it's not the first time we've been to Croatia, but Donna and I did have a trip through Croatia. This is where Croatia sits in reference to the rest of Europe. And you can see it has most of the coastline of the former Yugoslavia, large chunk of it. Dubrovnik, which is of course the hottest tourist area, is way down here at the south. Split, which is probably the second hottest area in some respects, is up here about halfway down the coast. And it's an ancient town, it basically founded by Diocletian. He had grown up just slightly north, so about where my pointer is now. I'm hoping you can all see the pointer and the
yes.
Yeah, good. So slightly north of that, he had grown up there, and he had retired here, and he had built shall we say, a villa that would make Bill Gates's 62,000 square foot home look kind of puny. So here it is. Here's his villa that he built. And the first thing you might notice of that is you can see there's one street going through this way. There's one going through this way. It's sort of rectangular. This is basically the design used by the Roman army when it made camp. And of course, it wouldn't make it out of bricks. They would just pile up, they would dig a ditch all the way around the rectangular and pile up the wood or pile up the dirt on the inside of the ditch to make a higher barrier. They could construct one of these in an hour to 2 hours. I mean, large enough to hold 10,000 men. Here's a picture from the sky of the same area today. And what I want to point out is you can see this octagonal building over here in the original structure. That is right here.
Wow.
Okay. That is nowadays the Cathedral of Split. Okay. Notice the tower right behind it in the current day picture, not here in the original one. This was put up about 1100, okay, and is the bell tower for the cathedral. So that's, you know, visiting this is what got me sort of interested in this topic. And this just shows sort of the front wall of that as it is today. But these bricks or these stones here are, a lot of them, or almost all of them, are from that original retirement villa that he had. When one goes into the actual cathedral, what this octagonal building was for him, obviously it wasn't a church, was his mausoleum. So this is where he wanted to be buried. And you can see in this cutaway diagram, this right here would have been his sarcophagus. Okay? Here's the octagonal building. You would come up these stairs. You still do, as you can see right here, to get into there. These Sphinx and lion here on either side are still there. You know, it's still basically the same building that Diocletian put up around 300. Okay. And it's really kind of interesting. You get into it, and of course, the inside, the first thing you notice when you walk in is, of course, Diocletian's sarcophagus is no longer there. I'll say something about that in a second. This is sort of where they broke through the wall into back here where the pointer is right now. That's the tower that they put up in 1100. Okay? And so the main altar is right here. Now you'll notice some things over here and here. Yeah, they're like almost every cathedral you go into in Europe, they're doing construction or renovation and stuff. But what you can see is that there are now obviously the tomb of a bishop here. In this, we have, of course, crucifixes added and everything, but you can see the height of this. It's not a very big space over here. You can see a couple of folks down here standing around, but the height is quite impressive. It's an interesting building from that perspective. So, so how did this mausoleum become a Christian church? And in 653, it's hard to say back to these dates, folks. It was consecrated by the first bishop of Split, and it's been the city's cathedral ever since. So it's actually the Cathedral of St. Dominus. I'm going to mispronounce every one of these Roman names, guys. Just get used to it. He's also the patron saint of Split, and he was bishop of the town a little further north at the time of Diocletian. He was persecuted by the emperor for his faith. How was he persecuted? Well, in point of fact, the emperor cut his head off eventually. So, so this, and his relics from him are in the treasury here of the cathedral. The sarcophagus that Diocletian was buried in, and his remains and everything were located in the center of the mausoleum. That was ritually destroyed when it became a church. And I didn't know that we actually had a ritual for destroying an emperor's sarcophagus, but apparently somebody came up with one. And so we have altars for two martyrs here, the one that the church is named after, and another one, both of whom were executed nearby in the town just north of Split, or what was the town just north of Split. It's been sort of absorbed by Split now.
Ken, this is a morbid question, but if they destroyed the sarcophagus, what happened to Diocletian's remains, the bones and so forth?
I suspect that they were smashed to pieces, but I'm not sure. I looked a lot for the answer to that question, Richard, because it struck me as well. And I wasn't able to find anything more than this statement.
So probably just scattered in the garbage dump or someplace.
Exactly. Yeah, he was not a particularly well-liked guy by Christians, as you can imagine. And it's very interesting. This cathedral is actually the oldest Catholic cathedral that is still housed in its original building without having major, total. I mean, there's other ones that are on the same site, but they've been so renovated so drastically that you can't recognize the original structure in them. But this one has been there since 653 without tremendous changes. The only real big change was the bell tower, which was constructed behind it in about 1100 AD. And that looks actually today looks like sort of part of it. It's in Romanesque style, which would of course been in vogue in 1100. And it sort of matches what Diocletian had put up. So here's just, and I'm going to go sort of right to left here. Here's a picture of that bell tower. This is where the stairs are up to the cathedral. Actually, no, I think that's actually from the side. So that would have been over here. Here's that octagonal shaped building. You can see it a little better over here. So that's the cathedral part, but this palace was huge, of course. And you'll remember that first picture I showed you, it comes right down onto the water. So there's a water entrance as well that you can pull up with a boat. At least there was, and originally that's been silted in now. It's 100 yards or more from the actual water now. But that meant that the palace was built on an angle, that it came down to the water's edge. And so the bottom, in order to keep the floors level, the bottom floor kept getting bigger. So at the water's end, this is the bottom floor of this. So you can see it's huge. Some of you may have seen this before. If you are, I'm blanking, folks. Here, the HBO, Donna, we watched it.
Oh, Game of Thrones?
Thank you so much, David. Game of Thrones, you will recognize this. I'm pretty sure that it was used as the site where all the dragon heads were at one point in time. And there are a couple of other scenes that were used down here in this. This part got totally preserved, and Richard, you will, I think, particularly enjoy this. It got totally conserved because during the Middle Ages, people ended up throwing all their garbage into it. And so it was filled with garbage, and that ended up helping preserve the building and made it a really good archaeological site for a lot of people pulling stuff out of there later, anthropologists. So what happened here? Why is Diocletian and Constantine after him important to us? Well, I think we probably have a pretty good idea why Constantine's important, but Diocletian maybe not. And what was happening is the empire was weakening. The sort of Pax Romana era ended about 180 in the Common Era. And it begins to weaken as it starts facing forces from the outside and not always good emperors on the inside. They started having some civil wars to get the succession figured out and everything. And so things were gradually getting worse. And so the emperors had to increase the size of the army in order to defend themselves against the barbarian tribes. That led to financial pressures, all sorts of things. If you look at the 20 emperors in the roughly 50-year period prior to Diocletian coming in, only one of them died a natural death. The other 19 were killed one way or the other. In some cases, killed in battle. There were Roman emperors that were killed in battle, but in most cases, killed by assassination by somebody in their own camp that didn't like them anymore. And most of the leaders were coming from the generals in the army. And that turned out probably to be, in some ways, a good thing, because that's where the most talented people ended up in a lot of cases. So what happened here? Well, decline and fall of the Roman empire has really happened very gradually. It happened in 3 stages. In the first stage, they had these internal problems, the politics, the economy, the military, the whole thing started gradually declining. And then there was a sort of respite in the second stage. And this was this brief period of revival. And that primarily featured 2 people, Diocletian and Constantine. And they were the ones who really enacted reforms that staved off the decline of that. But of course, later, in the third stage, the barbarians, and particularly in the West, the Western Roman Empire is part of the Roman Empire, were able to gain access and eventually sacked Rome, etc. Interesting point, though, and this is something I didn't really realize. Starting with Diocletian, the empire really, or the capital really was wherever the emperor was. And he wasn't in Rome very much, nor were any of the other emperors after him. And so the Roman Empire is only Roman in name, so to speak, and in some respects after him. Okay, so who is Diocletian? Where was he? He was born Diocles, which translates as glory of Zeus, in Dalmatia, modern Croatia, in about 245. Came from a poor family. We're not sure exactly what his father did. Probably a scribe, but maybe a freeman from one of the senators or something. It's hard to say. Diocletian had a real natural talent for leadership, military leadership. He rose through the ranks to become a general, to be leading a legion on the Danube. And in 283, he becomes commander of the Imperial Guard. At this point in time, that was, always that was an important unit because they were guarding the emperor. And then and this was during a campaign in Iraq, and the emperor dies. The emperor at that time had 2 sons, and he sort of bequeathed the empire to these 2 sons. And one was over in the western part in Gaul at the time, and one was in the east in Iraq, where Diocletian was. So the eastern son decides, well, I'm going to go back, or somebody decides, it's hard to say who here, I'm going to start moving back towards Rome. And he dies. Now, his cohort of folks around him were saying he had an eye infection, and so he couldn't be in the light. So he was in a closed box. Well, after about 4 days travel through the heat of Iraq, some of the soldiers started knowing his smell from this box, and they opened the box, and the emperor was dead. Okay, the son. And so the senior commanders all got together and said, well, we're going to choose another emperor. And Diocletian was chosen. There was another candidate, and Diocletian made sure that he was murdered very shortly thereafter. So there's a lot of that going on. So in 285, Diocletian battles the other son in a battle in Serbia, which he actually loses. Okay? But he, in fact, wins it in the end because the other son gets murdered by one of his officers. And it's not clear if the officer was in the pay of Diocletian, okay, so he might have been a paid assassin, or there's some accounts that say the officer was having an affair with the Western son's wife and killed him to sort of get out of a sticky situation there, okay? Be that as it may, Diocletian then goes to Rome, one of the few times that he actually went to Rome. And this is actually his longest stay. And he goes to Rome to get the senates to recognize the army's choice of the emperor, because the Senate still had to sort of officially make that official. And then he goes about what was really in some ways, his greatest accomplishment from the point of view of the empire, which was reestablishing stability of the empire and trying to get it out of this cycle of violence where every year or two they kill the emperor and start afresh. So he strengthens the military and he does a number of other things. I'll give you a list in a second of some of the things he did, but other emperors obviously tried this, but they simply didn't have his force and everything that he was able to pull it off. And how did he do it? Well, he did a number of things which were administrative reforms. And the tetrarchy, essentially rule of 4, was probably one of the most important things. He realized, and I don't know why this didn't dawn on any previous emperors, probably because they all pretty egotistical, but he realized that the Roman Empire was really too big to be run by one man. And so he appointed a co-emperor and then 2 junior emperors that worked for them. So that he and the co-emperor were Augusti, or they were both had the word Augustus to their name. And the junior emperors became then Caesars, and they got to add Caesar to their name. And the idea, of course, was that when a Augusti died or retired, he would be replaced then by his junior emperor, would move up the line, and they'd pick a new guy for junior emperor, okay, for Caesar. The other important administrative thing that Diocletian did was he separated the civil and military bureaucracies. So he basically created the Department of Defense for Rome, and he made changes in the Roman military. He, as you will see later, there were a lot of Christians in the military, surprisingly. It's a big surprise to me, I think, but he started pushing them out. He put in wage and price controls to stop or slow down at least the inflation, which was killing him. He had a major taxation reform, and his taxation reform was basically and maybe this is why he didn't go back to Rome, first capital, was to tell the people of Rome that they had to pay their taxes, and the people of Italy that they had to pay taxes, because up to this point, Roman citizens, or that is citizens of the city of Rome and Italy, weren't paying taxes. The taxes were all being generated in the provinces. And so that made the Roman Empire really a cohesive whole. If you think about it, it's sort of like the situation we have today in some ways, in that there are a lot of folks who would be much happier if we tax the upper 1% a little more, okay? The upper 1% wouldn't be very happy about that. And that's the sort of thing that he did. He had other reforms that he had in the economic package as well. But his last thing that he did was to persecute Christians. And there's a number of reasons for this. Christians don't really fit into the state religion. which of course is the Greek religion renamed in terms of the Roman gods, with Jupiter at the head and all of that. And the emperor associated himself directly with Jupiter. And there were, of course, sacrifices that were made, supposedly should be made to the Roman gods. Christians didn't do that. He wasn't happy about that at all. And so he persecuted Christians. So this is, this picture here, you might recognize if you've been to Venice. It is embedded in the outside of St. Mark's Cathedral. And it shows the four emperors, the two Augusti and the two Caesars, and each as sort of pairs, and they're all holding their swords to say, okay, we're going to defend each other. And in each case, one of the Caesar has his hand over on the corresponding Augusti to say, I'm going to support you, that sort of things. So in order to hold power, Diocletian decided he had to share power. As they say, basically, this is keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer, type of thing. And so he names Maximian, who was another soldier from the Balkans, who worked his way up in command, as another Augustus, a co-emperor, in charge of the West, while keeping the richer eastern provinces for himself. The East was really where was the breadbasket. Egypt and some of the other areas were important there. He also names them as Caesars, as junior emperors then, Constantius, and Galerius. And so if you look at these four men, they have real similarities. They were all born poor. They were all from the Balkans, and they all came up through the army. So he picks three other guys who he feels he can trust. And the way this worked is he then divided the empire, and it wasn't quite as formal a division as what Constantine and what others made later, I should say, not Constantine, but you can see they had four different places where their homes were. None of them was Rome. Okay, and this sort of gives you an idea of where Diocletian and Maximian, how they divided things up in terms of things. But make no mistake, you remember the quote from Animal Farm that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. and so the two Augusti might have been equal, but Diocletian was more equal than Maximian. He still was the dominant, the senior emperor, if you will. And yeah, Richard?
I think it's interesting to note this is the Roman Empire, but none of the four leaders are living in Rome.
Right, exactly. And for the rest of the history of the empire, that was pretty much true.
Yeah, right.
People visited, they didn't live there. So all four were equal. Interestingly, Diocletian started referring to himself as Jupiter, and Maximian, his other co-emperor, as Hercules. So think about that. Jupiter is the head god. Hercules was his demigod son, and so that sort of sets where things are in terms of this. So Diocletian maintained control over the overall strategy and made final decisions if it was really, somebody had to make that sort of decision. And so for most of the rest of the history of the empire, we have two emperors. Actually goes back for a little while, of course, under Constantine. Okay, so the other thing I mentioned was that he persecuted Christians. And this is sort of the great persecution. There have been previous persecutions of Christians by Roman emperors back around 250 or a little before that. Things weren't going so well. So what do you want? You want a scapegoat, right? And Christians were a great scapegoat. And basically, that's part of what's going on here as well. Any problems you have, you blame them on the Christians. And so considering that most of the empire is pagan at this point in time, that was a good thing to do. So they looked at worship of Jupiter and the other pagan gods as being directly connected to the health of the empire in their minds. The Christians don't do that. They didn't make sacrifices to the god on behalf of the emperor. That really made Diocletian mad. He considered this a dereliction of duty. At that time, the Christians were about 10% of the population, and it was growing. And so that was a concern too. And particularly it was growing in the army. And that was a real concern for him. And so about 303, he starts doing persecutions. And he and his Caesar, his junior emperor, Galerius, went full head on steam, full way into this. Interesting, Maximian and Constantinus did not persecute Christians. So if you were in the West, you were safe, basically. If you were in the East, like the bishops I mentioned earlier, you could lose your head, literally. What did he really do in this time? Well, he started by ordering the destruction of all churches and burning of all scriptures that were found in the churches. He arrested leading Christian citizens, and he arrested all Christian clergy. He initially imprisoned them until they would make sacrifices to the Roman gods, which most of them, of course, did not do. And a year or so later, he starts just executing them if they would not sacrifice. He let his junior emperor, Galerius, do most of the actual persecution. So this became Galerius's thing, and to the point that early Christian documents identify Galerius as the most evil man ever to have lived. So, yeah. So interestingly, Diocletian becomes ill. He decides to retire, to split in 305. Maximian, he forces basically Maximian to retire. Maximian doesn't really want to retire, but he forces him to retire to southern Italy at the same time. Constantinus and Galerius become the Augusti, and two new people, Dea and Severus, become the Caesars. Okay? Later, Diocletian dies 6 years later in December of 311 and is buried in the mausoleum. Okay, so where does that get us? Well, that gets us into a real mess, because while initially this looked like it was working the way that Diocletian had set it up, it didn't work well, and civil war breaks out. Both of the new Caesars had links to Galerius. One was his nephew, the other one was an old army buddy. Okay? So they didn't like Constantinus as much. But the bigger problem was the sons of Maximian and Constantinus. That's Maxentius and Constantine being the one that we immediately know, right? Those two sons feel like, well, they're getting passed over here, that they should have been the new Caesars. Constantius dies in York, in England, in July of 306. And as his Caesar, Servius should have replaced him. But Constantine claims the position with the support of his father's army. Okay? And initially uses then the title Caesar rather than Augustus. That was kind of interesting that he did it that way. In the meantime, back in Rome, the Romans are not terribly happy about all those taxes that Diocletian's making them pay. And so they decide that Maximian's son, would be a better emperor than Galerius, and so they, in the Praetorian Guard, make him emperor in Rome, and he decides that he would become a Caesar also, and he calls his father out of retirement. So Maximian then comes out of a retirement. Constantine recognizes him then as Augustus and Maxentius as Caesar by then marrying his daughter to Maxentius. Galerius, of course, is unhappy about this. He's over in the east. He's at this point, he's the Augustus over there, legitimate as far as he's concerned. So he sends his Caesar to go battle. So Servius wants to, and he loses the battle at Rome. He tries to attack the walls of Rome. Of course, he couldn't break them, and he eventually is defeated, and he gets executed. At this point, Maximian tries to get Diocletian back, which leads to the cabbages quote. Okay, that's where all that came in. Galerius appoints another guy, Licinius, as Caesar in the east, but Galerius dies in 311, and so Licinius becomes the Augusti for the east then. Not happy with the other folks in the west. So this leaves a battle then between Constantine and Maxentius for control of the west, because they're both in the west. Interestingly, there's this thing that happens 2 years before they go head to head, in which Constantine witnesses a solar halo. So solar halo, you see the sun and you see sort of a halo around it. Okay? And he talks to a whole bunch of folks about, what does this mean? What is this sign? And the Christian bishops that he talks to told him that this was a sign not from the sun god, who he had worshipped early in his life, but from Christ. And he takes that to heart. And this, I haven't mentioned it, but his mother is a Christian. His mother, Helena, is a Christian. His father was not. His father worshipped that sun god as well, I believe. So anyway, so Maxentius is in Rome. Constantine brings his legions to Rome, and they're going to have a battle. But the evening before the armies are preparing for battle, Constantine has this vision, leads him to fight under the protection of the Christian God. Basically, he had already, even before that, though, had all of his soldiers paint the Kairos sign on their shields. Of course, a Christian image on their shields. So it was clear that he was coming into this with some Christian background, if you will. Maxentius, I should say, had twice as many troops as Constantine, you know. But to be honest, he made some really significant and stupid mistakes in terms of his placement. He put his troops way too close to the Tiber. They were sort of backed up against the river. And so when the battle commenced, Constantine was able to force the troops back. They had no place to go except this bridge, which was too small to accommodate them. And it's a disaster. A lot of the troops try to go swim the Tiber, including Maxentius, and he drowns. Okay, and that's the end of the battle. So now Constantine is totally in charge of the West. He meets with Licinius, who's in charge of the East. They issue the Edict of Milan. Actually, Licinius is the one who really issues it because it recognizes Christianity as a legitimate religion and returns all the confiscated property that Diocletian had confiscated from the Christians, returns it back to the Christians. And so this is happening both in the eastern end of the empire, where Licinius is still in charge, and in the western part, where Constantine is in charge. Things never get calmed down, though. Constantine and Licinius have continual wars from about 316 to 324. I'm not going to go through all that. There's a lot of this battle, that battle type stuff. But bottom line is that by 324, Constantine defeats Licinius and reunites the empire. So we're back to one emperor and one empire. So what about Constantine? He had become a junior emperor in 306. He died in 337. And, you know, as you've seen somewhat, he's rose from a poor background to become emperor. He won control of the western part of the empire first, and then defeated Licinius to take control of the eastern part and reunited the empire. He reformed the military. One of his biggest reforms was to sort of separate and have garrisons posted along the frontier, and then have another group, which were actually more highly paid, of soldiers who were sort of a rapid response troop and could go wherever the empire was threatened very rapidly. He also did a lot of overhauls to the administration of the empire. One of the most important things is that he standardized the money. Over the last few emperors, even to some extent with Diocletian, but certainly the ones before him, the money kept getting debased. There was less and less silver or gold in the money, and more copper. And Constantine comes back and standardizes the coinage, brings out a new golden coin, which becomes the standard thing. And that slows inflation and really helps the empire. I should just say one comment about the picture of his head over here. This from approximately here where the neck is to the top here in this statue, that's about 10 feet.
Wow.
This was not a man who lacked ego. But, you know, he did all these important things and everything, but what do we remember him for? We remember him for two things: Constantinople, you know, forming that city, and Christianity, and bringing the Christian religion to the Roman Empire. But I think you got to remember that he basically ruled the pagan empire.
You're getting some kudos from, sorry to interrupt in the chat, you're getting some kudos from Gloria, who will be leaving us in a moment.
Okay.
It says you're better than PBS.
Yeah, better than PBS. Thank you, Gloria. So he would really, you know, reverenced all the gods. He, particularly Apollo, was god of the sun. The presented a lot of gifts to him before 308. He regularly got advice from soothsayers, which was a long-standing, as you know from Shakespeare, if nothing else, Julius Caesar, tradition in Rome. He placed his new residence under the protection of the god of martyrs and the heathen goddess of fortune. He remained the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the pagan hierarchy till the end of his life. And he brought out coins which had to have been pretty confusing in one sense, and because one side had the name of Christ on them, and the other side showed a picture of him with the sun god. Okay, and so a lot of you might think he's kind of confusing there, but you got to remember the first statement. He ruled a pagan empire, and he had sort of a professional life, if you will, and his personal life. And he clearly gradually became more and more Christian in his personal life, and that affected his professional life eventually. So he wasn't always a nice guy. He ordered the execution of Maximinus and his brother-in-law after he promised them mercy. He caused the death of his nephew and his eldest son. He killed his eldest son. It's thought that he also caused the death of his wife. And this is in addition to all the wars he was involved in. So Christianity didn't exactly bring any moral transformation here. Conversion never makes somebody perfect, that's for sure. But what did he do? He certainly is known as the first Christian emperor. There was one prior emperor who may have been a Christian, but he didn't last very long, and so it doesn't really count. He Christianized Rome, but in a very diplomatic way. So, so in his official business, he tried to be inoffensive to pagans. So if you look at he built major buildings near the Forum, and areas in there. Didn't put church symbols. I think there was one building that had a cross on it, but other than that, and it wasn't a church either. But basically, he built a bunch of churches, but they were on the edge of the city, away from the Forum, away from the downtown area. This includes St. John in the Lateran, and also the residence for the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. St. John's was the initial home church, if you will, of the Bishop of Rome. He also built the Church of Old St. Peter's in the Vatican area that rested on the site that where presumably St. Peter had died. So these are important things. He showed a lot of respect for the early popes that were lived. He had given them their residency, which had been one of his. But he did not hesitate to actually exercise supreme authority in the church. As far as he was concerned, Pope was here, Emperor was up here. Okay, and so a little different. Popes got obviously more power as things went on. So what did he do again? His conversion to Christianity, he made state funds go to churches. He made priests and other leaders, Christian leaders, exempt from certain types of public service. He enacted laws that restrict pagan worship eventually and encouraged people to convert to Christianity. He made it almost essential that if you wanted to go up in the hierarchy in the government, you had to be a Christian. He made Sunday a legal holiday and added days like Easter to the official calendar. Interestingly, he was quite willing to authorize the use of violence against Christians that weren't orthodox as far as he was concerned. And I know Richard has talked about the Arians or heresy. Is Christ an equal part of God, or is he something lower than God the Father? And of course, it was Constantine that called the Council of Nicaea to deal with that. And we said the Nicene Creed this morning in church, and that sort of took care of that, put Christ and the Holy Spirit as an integral part of God. Interestingly, he also funded his mother, Helena, who was Christian, as I mentioned before, for a trip to the Holy Land, where she built a lot of churches, and he paid for those. So the original structure of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built by his mother. He was baptized shortly before he died. And you'll see a lot of folks will say, in some of the literature, they'll say, oh, well, that's when he became Christian. I think he really became a Christian earlier than that. But at that time, late baptism was normal. And the idea was that you didn't want to commit any sins between the time you were baptized and the time you died. And the easiest way to assure yourself of that, because that's thought to be a way to get into heaven, right? The easiest way to assure that was to put off baptism until right before you died. So a little bit different viewpoint of the importance of baptism and what it was about than what we have today. So he had to work out the relationships between his old beliefs in the sort of unconquered sun, God, Apollo, etc., and his new Christian God. But anytime after about 312, there was no doubt that Constantine was spreading the gospel, that he was making, building splendid churches, that he was making being a Christian a safe thing to be and an important thing to be. And I think you have to consider him Christian at that point in time. So a little controversy there. Okay, that is it. Okay, so questions, anything? Hi, Darlene.
Hi, Darlene.
Any
Ken, you
thoughts?
mentioned that the Christian 10% or so of the population was growing, particularly in the army, and it should also be pointed out that it was growing among the commercial class, and particularly people involved in transportation and trade. And this was a particular threat to the empire because it could threaten supply routes.
Absolutely correct. Now, most of the Christians were urban.
Right.
You didn't find the Christians out on the farms. So it was interesting from that perspective.
And of course, the word pagan means farmer.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, I didn't know that.
A couple of things I found interesting in your presentation. I'm not sure and offer some comment. Number one is just an observation. I think many of us may already know that December 25th is the feast day of the unconquered sun.
Really?
Yeah, so it was already a public holiday. So it made sense for Christmas over there. But getting back to his pagan roots, you said his name meant the glory of Zeus, which is the name in the.
That was Diocletian's name.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Going back to Diocletian before Constantine. I'm sorry. Going back to Diocletian, he equated himself with Jupiter, but can you comment on why he has a name that harkens back to the Greek pantheon?
Sure. Well, he was born in Dalmatia. Okay. Currently, that's the Greek area of the empire.
Okay.
So as the empire goes on after Constantine and everything, that they eventually just speak Greek over there. They lose Latin as a language, and even later, after of course the western part of the empire falls, Justinian, one of the Byzantine emperors, makes inroads to bring some of the empire back, has Ravenna as his capital, and if you have a chance to go to Ravenna, do it. It has the most beautiful mosaics I think I've ever seen. They're incredible. And they date from the time of Justinian. But you know, there's really a Greek world over there. And of course, Constantinople itself lasts until 1458, I think it was, or something like that, when the Muslims finally breached the walls. Yeah, so what Constantine does there, and I didn't really say much about Constantinople or anything like that. It's a time constraint, obviously. You could spend a whole hour on just that aspect of Constantine's life. You know, he constructed Hagia Sophia, a wonderful church, which was converted to a mosque, then converted to a museum, and now has been converted back to a mosque again. You know, that type of thing. So a lot of very interesting history there.
Okay, thank you. Did he do state business in Latin or Greek?
I think he did state business. Diocletian, or excuse me, Constantine probably did. Well, Diocletian certainly did state business in Latin. I mean, he obviously had a lot of scribes, but that would have been still the official language. But there's certainly, you know, and there were earlier emperors who really appreciated the Greek end of the spectrum, so to speak, of the empire, and of course the religion is, you know, basically they just renamed the Greek gods and kept on with the same religion. Basically, I mean, you know, they went through a whole phase where emperors became gods, and that was another you know, sort of thing. And the other thing I guess I should comment is Helena, his mother, obviously had a big influence on him, and I didn't speak much about that, but I think one of the things you get out of studying the Roman Empire is there were a number of times when there were women who I mean, obviously they were never allowed to become emperor, but boy, they really influenced things. Starting right from the beginning with Augustus's wife, Livia. Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of interesting to know. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Masterpiece Theater I Claudius things, in which she is the epitome of evil and things, I think, in some respects, but I don't know that she was that evil, but I think she supported Augustus. I'm not sure that she ever poisoned him at all. Anyways, that's a totally different topic. Okay.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Ken.
Yeah.
Next month, I'll put out notices, obviously, but we will have our final forum for this year, and it's going to be on COVID-19 and where we stand. That's a moving target, so I'm not exactly sure how Marcia and I are going to split this, and maybe Pastor will be involved as well, because I think we need to talk a little bit about what we're doing as a church, and hopefully Council will discuss this by then.
Yeah, I think Ken, we'd also said at one time we might try to get Brad involved.
Yeah.
Because there's whole issues of how do you worship in this new world, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's certainly, even if we're getting past the COVID, folks, we got to be prepared for the next pandemic. I really hate to say that, but I think
you're right.
We have to. And so I think it's going to be maybe easier the next time, in the sense of we know what we have to do, but we should have a contingency plan. Yeah. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I
thank you.
enjoyed looking this one up. It was kind of fun.
Go ahead.
Okay, oops, I gotta go.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
good week.
Remember, you're
Okay,
better than
bye-bye.
anybody else.
Bye.
Bye.
Good seeing you.
Take care. Take care.
Okay, I'm trying to see.
I'm recording.
That video. Ah, here we go.